Well, good afternoon. I'm Stephen Moss. I'm the chair of JPR, Jewish Policy Research, and a very warm welcome to you all for this afternoon's event, which is co-sponsored by the Jewish Leadership Council. So first of all, a big thank you to them for partnering with us, as that's hugely appreciated. Like us, they strongly believe in the power of high quality research and data to inform strategic decision-making in the community. And talking of the community, we are delighted that so many from right across the community and its constituent organisations are with us for this very first chance to look at the 2022 census data. Now, the UK national census data on the Jewish community is absolutely fundamental to our understanding of the Jewish population in England and Wales. It's an incredible resource and data set, as you will shortly hear. JPR's Executive Director, Dr. Jonathan Boyd, will be sharing with us how previous census data has been used to support Jewish community planning. And he'll talk about how we're going to do that going forward with the new data as it becomes available. Because today we are sharing just the very first release of data on the Jewish community, literally on the day it's released from the Office of National Statistics. There's going to be a lot more to come as the ONS gradually release more tranches of data, which we will share as they are made public over the course of the next year or so. And that will help us to produce a much deeper and more fascinating picture of the Jewish community, and will be supported by the results of a survey that we're currently conducting on other aspects of the community's Jewish identity. Now, following John Boyd's sharing of insights from today's data release, Michelle Janes, the co-chief executive officer of the JLC, will join him in conversation and also put some of your questions to him within the time allotted. And the plan is to end the session promptly at 6 o'clock, so that those of you that are keen on watching the football will have plenty of time to do so. And so I won't hold you up any further and instead hand over now to John Boyd.
Thank you, Stephen, and welcome everybody. A real pleasure to be here on this auspicious day. It's an auspicious day, I think, for three reasons, actually. First of all, it's worth mentioning that as Professor Colin Chinder reminded us in the Jewish Chronicle last week, today is actually the 75th anniversary of the United Nations partition vote on the 29th of November 1947, a key moment that really led to the establishment of the State of Israel. And today, you know, we're talking about Jewish demography here in Britain, but I'm very conscious that Israel's existence has had huge implications for Jewish demography worldwide. I'm conscious that, you know, had that not happened, I think the figures we'd be looking at today would probably look very different indeed. So that's reason number one why today is an auspicious day. The second reason, as Stephen has already said, is that today is the first day that the Office for National Statistics has released the religion data from the census, and I hope I will show you over the course of the next half an hour or so just how significant those data are. It's important to understand that we're not looking at data for the whole of the United Kingdom. We are just focused on data for England and Wales. That's what's been released today. And the third reason I think today is important is conscious that here we're talking about England and Wales, where I imagine many people's minds are less on England and Wales and more on England versus Wales. And as Stephen said, we do promise to get through this quickly and hope to finish by 6 o'clock. That's the plan anyway, so that people can get back in time for the football if they want to watch it. I'm going to present some of the findings from the data that were released today in just a moment. If you want to ask any questions, this is how we're doing that this evening. We're using an application that many people will have seen before called Slido, slido.com. The information's coming up at the bottom of the screen. You can either go to slido.com and input the code number that is there on the bottom of the screen, or if you have a smartphone, open up your camera, point it at the QR code in the in the top right-hand corner. There it is, of your screen, and click the link, and that will take you directly into it. And you can just type your questions in, and then that information will be fed through to us, and we will have some time at the end to ask those questions. So without further ado, I'm going to jump to the presentation. So if we can get that up on the screen now, that would be great. And let's jump in. So let me do a few words just about the 2021 census first of all. Important to understand, this is the single largest data gathering exercise in the UK, and it really is the gold standard of social research. Just to give you a sense, there are in the 2011 census, there were 265,000 Jews enumerated. In a typical survey, for example, on voting patterns that are put out by the various different polling companies, you typically have a sample size of maybe 1,000, possibly 2,000. So just the scale of the data that you get from a census is really, really quite extraordinary. The second thing to say, hold on, if I can move my slides forward. There we go. There we go. Is that all households are legally required to complete a census form. So this really is very, very comprehensive data. If you don't complete it, you are chased up and ultimately fined for not doing so. So it's about as comprehensive as it ever gets. Third thing to say is there are actually 3 separate censuses that occur at the same time, one in England and Wales, one in Scotland, one in Northern Ireland. 2021 was a bit of an exception in that regard because the Scottish census was delayed for a year. It took place in March 2022 instead of March 2021 because of the pandemic. They decided to delay. So that's why we don't have any data from Scotland yet. Some data have been released from Northern Ireland, but not yet specific data about Jews. So there's not much we can say about that at this stage. Next thing just to be conscious of is that the 2021 census was really a digital first, in the sense that most households completed the census form online. That may have had some implications in terms of how people responded to it. It's a difference between responding to something online and on paper. There are known differences between those sorts of things, and we don't yet have a full understanding of that, but it's one of the things to bear in mind. And the other thing that's important to bear in mind is that it happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, and some of the results we're seeing raise some interesting questions about how where the Jewish population was, or where populations generally were, because of the pandemic, where the people were not in their places where they would normally be. So that may have some bearing on some of the results we're seeing. Next thing just to be conscious of is the religion question is one of 3 questions in the 2021 census that is voluntary. I said previously that all households are legally obligated to complete the form, but there are 3 questions, one of which is the religion question, that is voluntary. You don't have to answer it. And that's also important to understand in terms of making sense of the data that we're looking at today. I'll say a little bit more about that when we come to it. This is the question. And how it would have appeared on your screen or on paper form that you filled out. You can see there it is. What's your religion? You can see there's a clear message at the top that says this question is voluntary, as I've already said. And you can also see that there is a tick box Jewish. And what we're looking at today is the people who ticked that box. Now, there are, of course, Jews who would choose not to answer this question because it's a voluntary question, or because they don't want to self-identify, in which case they wouldn't be recorded here. So this is not a complete picture of the whole Jewish population. It's about as complete as we're ever going to get, but it is not 100% complete. Now, what did we see? Here's the top line information. In 2001, this question was asked for the first time, and 259,927 Jews ticked the box. In 2011, that had climbed to 265,073. Not a big climb, but nevertheless a climb. And the big reveal for now, for those who haven't seen it yet, is in 2021, the figure that was released today is 271,327, which you don't need to be a statistician to realize is a higher number still. So based on these numbers alone, we can see that the Jewish population of England and Wales appears to be growing. Lots of caveats around that, voluntary question, etc. But just purely on the basis of what we're seeing, there is evidence here to suggest the Jewish population is growing. And that, by the way, is what we expected to happen, exactly what we expected to see. The best estimates that we had in the office were somewhere in the 270 to 273, 74 figure. So we, based on other evidence about Jewish population trends, that is pretty well exactly what we expected to see here. Now, is that the total Jewish population? No, it's not. And there is one simple thing that we can do initially to explore what the real figure might be, or at least to get closer to what the real figure might be. And that is by doing the following thing. If you can see in the blue columns the numbers I just showed you, one of the options in that voluntary question is not to respond to it. Right? You don't have to answer it. It's a voluntary question. So the red line that I'm showing you is the national rate of non-response to that question in 2001, 2011, 2021. You can see it's declined over that period. It was 6% this time. Now, if we take that into consideration, so if we account for those people who, if we assume that the rate of non-response amongst Jews was the same as it was amongst the population as a whole, and we account for that in the figures, we get the figures in the orange columns, which are close, as you can see, 281 climbing to 285, climbing to 288, 646. So based on that assessment, and it really is a very initial assessment, we can adjust these figures up a little bit. Now, what else is missing here? Well, first of all, as I said, we're missing Jews in Scotland. So the numbers in Scotland that were recorded, you can see there, about 6,500 in 2001, just under 6,000 in 2011. Jews in Northern Ireland, we don't yet know. Very, very few of them, by the way, 365 in 2001, 335 in 2011. The other big question that often comes up around census data is, what about those Jews who don't self-identify as Jewish by religion? Because remember, the question we're dealing with here is about what is your religion, but do choose to identify as Jewish by ethnicity. And some Jews do that. And the way they would do that is there is an ethnicity question. There isn't a Jewish box in the ethnicity question, but there is an option to write in Jewish in that ethnicity question. Now, what happened is in 2001, there were about 12,000 people who wrote in Jewish in that box. In 2011, that had climbed to 33,000. This time, 2021, this is the figure that was released today, that number had climbed to 67,000, almost 68,000. So that's a very interesting climb and a very interesting trend, and worth thinking about and discussing in due course. What's important to understand, however, is that most of the people, certainly in 2001 and 2011, who self-identified as Jewish by ethnicity also self-identified as Jewish by religion. So the figures in brackets there, next to 2001, the plus 2,594, and 2011 plus 8,558. Those are the people who self-identified as Jewish by ethnicity, but not by religion. We don't know what that number is yet for 2021. But we would expect it to go up, given the trends of the numbers we can see, possibly up to about 15,000. But that's guesswork at the moment. We'll have to wait a little bit longer before we know that. But what's also important to understand is we have adjusted the figures on the left by the rate of non-response. Now, many of the Jews who choose not to respond to this question may well identify, and indeed do identify, as Jewish by ethnicity. So most of those people who I would identify as Jewish by ethnicity but not by religion would be included in the figures in those orange columns. So we're not talking about adding them to the orange columns. Most of them would already be included in there. There'll be much more to say about ethnicity in due course. That's about as much as we know at this stage. Let's move on. The next sort of important question I think to bear in mind is, who is a Jew? That question of who are we counting, who are we not counting here? So just worth saying that the figures that tend to get used internationally about the size of the Jewish population is what's known as the core Jewish population, and that is those people who self-identify as Jewish in censuses and surveys. And that's really the kind of that includes all the people that we've been talking about so far, those people who have self-identified either as Jewish by religion or by ethnicity in the census. And we know from census and from various other sources that the Jewish population of the UK at the moment is estimated to be around 292,000. Some people say it's as much as 300,000, but it's in that ballpark. There is we could go smaller than that. We could talk about the affiliated Jewish population, i.e. those people who not only self-identify but are also affiliated to a Jewish organization, particularly in the case of the UK, a synagogue. And that figure for the UK as a whole is around the 185,000. So it's a smaller number than the core Jewish population. But we can also go larger. For example, we could talk about the population with Jewish parents. So this would be everyone who self-identifies as Jewish, but also anyone who doesn't self-identify as Jewish, but has a self-identifying Jewish parent or parents. And that figure is estimated to be around 330,000. There's also a definition called the enlarged Jewish population, and that's basically anyone who is a self-identifying Jew. Sorry, let's go back. Anyone who's a self-identifying Jew plus anyone who lives with them. So imagine a scenario where you have a self-identifying Jew who's married to a non-Jewish partner and bringing up their children as not Jewish. All of those people would be included in the enlarged Jewish population, and that's enumerated at about 370,000. These are not census data; these are data that have been worked out using other means. And the fourth or the fifth important definition is what's called the law of return Jewish population, and that's basically anyone with at least one self-identifying Jewish grandparent and their households. And for the UK, that figure is estimated to be about 410,000. We can go broader than that still. We could talk about non-Jews who claim some sort of distant ancestral link to Jews going back beyond their grandparents' generation. We don't have a count for that, but there are different ways of understanding the Jewish population. And all of these figures are correct depending on what definition one is using. Just to put the figures that I've shared with you, particularly the census figures, into context. This is the kind of the history of Jewish demography really since the middle of the 19th century. And the important piece I just want to highlight is what happened in the second half of the 20th century. And you can see to the right of this chart that the Jewish population declined pretty dramatically from the 1950s to about 1990. And then it really started to stabilize from the beginning of the 21st century. The figures we're seeing at the moment from the census of small growth, but nevertheless growth from 2001 to 2011 to 2021, therefore is actually really, really significant because the vast majority of Jewish populations in the diaspora are in a state of decline. What's happening here in the UK is something slightly different. It's certainly stable and it's probably growing. So there's something pretty extraordinary, both historically, certainly in terms of the last 70, 80 years or so, and in terms of geography around the world and other diaspora communities that are in terms of the stability and the possible growth that we're seeing. Just a little bit of contextual stuff also about the data that were released today. These are the proportions of the population of England and Wales as a whole that variously identified as Christian on the left, as having no religion, as saying religion not stated, i.e. not answering the question, or self-identifying as some other religion, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, etc. And the figures here in blue are from 2001, in orange 2011, red the ones that were released today in 2020 for 2021. Couple of things or three things I think to point out. The first thing is looking at the Christian population. Something truly extraordinary has happened in this country today, and it was headline news on the BBC and I'm sure elsewhere, is that the Christian population, which was 72% of the total just 20 years ago has now fallen below 50%. We officially live in a country that is no longer majority Christian, even though the Christian population is by far and away the largest religious group in the country. That, I believe, has all sorts of symbolic implications for this country over time, and we'll see what happens in that respect. But the Christian population is very clearly declining. The second thing is the no religion population, people who say, I don't have a religion at all. You can see the opposite has happened. It has grown dramatically from 15% now to 37%. It's actually getting close to the self-identifying Christian population. The growth of secularism, atheism, etc., is one of the big stories of Britain that is going on at the moment, and also has all sorts of implications, I think, for the Jewish community and for other religious communities. And the last thing I'll draw your attention to is the other religion group on the right. Even though it's small compared to the two groups we've just been talking about, you can see that the other religions, and as I said, that's Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jews, Buddhists, etc., that part of the population is growing and now comprises more than 1 in 10. We're living in an increasingly multicultural society. In terms of numbers of those other religious groups, these are numbers, not proportions, you can just get a sense of what's happening. The Muslim population, which was about 1.5 million 20 years ago, is now approaching 4 million. The Hindu population has almost doubled in size from 550,000 to 1 million plus. The Sikh population's climbed from 330 to 525 or so, 524. The Jewish population, as you can see, has grown a little bit, but is essentially stable. Buddhist population has grew more dramatically between 2001 and 2011 than it did in the last 10 years, but nevertheless has grown. And people saying they belong to another religious group, not Christian, have also grown. So just to kind of get a sense of the proportions here and the scale of different groups, we really see very clearly from census data what multicultural Britain, if you like, looks like. Going back to this, so one of the things that's really important to understand about the census is that the way the analysis works is, as I said, we identify all those people who tick Jewish in the box, but then what we're interested in is how Jewish people answer all of the other questions in the census, and there are lots of other questions in the census. Questions about where people live, how old they are, who lives in their households, who they're married to or partnered with, their ethnic background, their country of birth, their living standards, their health, educational achievement, work and employment, all of that sort of information is within the census. What has been released today is just the first of those, geography, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. The rest of the data will be released gradually over the course of the next year or so. And as Stephen said at the beginning, as new data are released, we'll be sharing more and more of it and utilizing it for all sorts of community purposes. But what I can share with you today is some information about the geography of the Jewish population, and that's what we'll jump into now. So here's the regional picture. We're looking at Jews here. You can see that London dominates. These, again, figures here in blue, orange and red for 2001, 2011, 2021. The Jews living in the Greater London area, pretty stable, slight decline we've seen. We've seen growth in the east of England. It's a slightly difficult name or term to in Jewish terms, but the east of England importantly includes South Hertfordshire area, and that's really what's causing the growth, the Jewish population in that area. Northwest importantly includes Manchester. We're seeing growth there as well. Other areas, well, let's click on so we can see the other areas a little bit more clearly. I've just changed the scale here. Jews in the southeast, so that includes Brighton, by the way. They're reasonably stable over that period. Yorkshire and the Humber, that includes Leeds, has declined. The southwest, which includes Bournemouth, declined and then grew again. The other areas, most of the other areas are pretty stable with the exception of the northeast, which we'll talk about a little bit, but a key piece of the northeast is Gateshead, just near Newcastle, where of course there's a very strong Haredi community, and we will talk about that in just a moment. These are those figures kind of cast in pie chart form, just to give you a sense of proportions. And you can see the slight decline in London. That's the large blue segment. But if you add the east of England to that, which is largely, as I said, South Hertfordshire, it's Radlett, it's Bushey, it's Elstree, it's those sorts of areas. You can see that London and those areas together are actually pretty stable proportionately. They're a sort of if you look at the blue and the orange together, there they reach more or less the same mark over that 20-year period. If you look at the grey of the northwest area, that includes and is mainly, by the way, Manchester. You can see that the Manchester Jewish population is growing. I'll talk a little bit about Manchester at the end, and the other areas are all largely pretty small. Here's what's happened over the course of the last 20 years in each of those areas. Growth, significant growth in the northeast, in the east of England, as I said, that includes South Hertfordshire. In the northwest, that includes Manchester. Interesting growth in the southwest, which includes Bournemouth, that we're seeing. Relatively small numbers, but nevertheless interesting growth there. Similarly, in the East Midlands, and decline everywhere else. The truth is, southeast and London pretty stable, but decline in Wales, West Midlands, and Yorkshire, and the Humber, which, as I said, is mainly Leeds. Just to talk a little bit about what we can do with geographical data, and I want to do that by just sharing the example of the Borough of Barnet. This is a map of London. You can see Barnet, Borough of Barnet clearly marked. There it is. And the figures for the Borough of Barnet, we have data down to this level at the moment. There were 46,000 Jews living in Barnet in 2001. That climbed to 54,000 in 2011. The figure released today is 56,616. So it's grown again, not quite by the same rate, but nevertheless, the Jewish population of the Borough of Barnet has grown. We don't yet have data at this level, but I want to show you what's coming, because what we can do, this is all data from 2011, is the data are not just shown at borough level, but they're also shared at ward level in due course. We don't yet have this, as I said, but we will do. So it's possible to take, for example, the Borough of Barnet, divide it up into 21 different wards and get the data for how many Jews live in each of those. We can go a level deeper still, what's called super output area mid-level. Now Barnet's divided up into 41 different areas, and we get data at that level. We will also in due course get data of what's called super output area lower level, and now Barnet's been divided up into 211 different areas, and we'll get the data at that level of granularity. And lastly, there's what's known as output area level, and this again is a map from 2011, but it's now Barnet's been divided up into 1,047 tiny little areas, and it's possible to get data with that level of granularity from census data, which is all pretty extraordinary. It allows us to produce maps like this. Again, this is from 2011, which show clearly sort of the density and the size of the Jewish population in different areas. This is always very striking to me. This is essentially the area running from Swiss Cottage up to Radlett and Bushey. There's I think in 2011, I don't have the data yet I don't have the figures yet for 2021, but there are about 140,000 Jews living in that area alone. You can see here Hackney, the sort of strong Jewish population in Stamford Hill. You can also see Redbridge and Epping Forest, that area, and the Jewish population nowhere near as large as in northwest London, but nevertheless shows up on this sort of map. And it's possible to produce these sorts of maps using census data. It's also possible to produce these sorts of maps, which they show change over time. The darker the shade of red, the greater the decrease. The darker the shade of blue, the greater the growth. This is between 2001 and 2011, and we'll produce these sorts of maps in due course to look at the change up to 2021. Haven't yet had time to do that because we only got the data about 8 hours ago. The other thing, just to show you, which I think is also important in terms of how these data can be used for community purposes, this is a map we produced for Stanmore Shul, Stanmore United Synagogue, a number of years ago. And that little box with a tiny little Magen David in the middle of it is Stanmore Shul. And it's possible to use census data to ascertain how many Jews live within, in this case, half a mile, 1.5 miles of a particular point on a map. So this is obviously just an example, but synagogues obviously know how many members they have, but they don't necessarily know how many Jews live in close proximity to their shul in order to put those membership figures into the context. Census data allow us to do that. So that's also like an important point to just to be conscious of in terms of community application of these data. Here are the borough data. These are the 10 largest Jewish populations by borough in 2021. You can see the figures for 2001, 2011, 2021 in each of those columns. You can see the numerical change over that 20-year period, and then the proportionate change in the right-hand column over that 20-year period. Few things just to point out. The places highlighted in green have all seen significant growth. Barnet, Hertsmere, I've already mentioned, but also very striking that there's significant growth in Hackney, Bury, Salford, and indeed Haringey, all areas where there are strong Haredi populations. And that's a big explanation for why the Jewish population of this country is growing. Other areas have seen decline in this top 10 group. Harrow, that's where Stanmore is, Redbridge, Leeds, less decline, but nevertheless not insignificant. And you can see the proportionate decline in that right-hand column. Quite an interesting story in Leeds, by the way, big decline from 8,200 to about 6,800 over those 10 years between 2001 and 2011, but that decline seems to have slowed down rather a lot over the last 10 years. We'll have to try and understand more about why that's the case over time, but interesting just to see. These are the next 10, so numbers 11 to 12 in the league table of Jewish populations by borough. And again, the table's constructed exactly the same way. We can see here a couple of places with very significant growth, Gateshead and Islington. Again, I think a lot of that is about the Haredi population. There's something odd, by the way, going on with the data from Gateshead that we'll need to unpick. If you look at the numbers, the climb from 2001 to 2011, it climbed from 1,500 to 3,000. From 2011 to 2021, it actually seems to have declined a little bit, which we're not quite sure why. It doesn't quite make sense. So we'll have to dig into that and find out why that's happened. But nevertheless, the overall picture is very much there of significant growth over that 20-year period. In terms of places here that have declined significantly, we can see parts of London, Brent, Enfield declined by 30–40%. Brighton and Hove has also declined over that period, although interestingly, similar story to Leeds. Significant decline between 2001 and 2011, but seems to have slowed quite considerably between 2011 and 2021. We've kind of mapped some of that data, that data by borough, and this is what the kind of the map looks like in 2001. If we just flick forward to the equivalent map for 2011, and maybe I'll just sort of click between them so you can see what's happening. Just focus on the places that I've highlighted: Brent, Enfield, and Bromley, and you can see that that's 2001, that's 2011, 2001. 2011, you can see all of those areas get a little bit lighter. That's a sign of population decline in those places. And then if we go to the change from 2011 to 2021, you can see here, focusing on Harrow and Redbridge, I'm going to click between them. That's 2011, that's 2021. I feel like an optician here. This is with, this is without. This is 2011, this is 2021. You can see both of those areas also became lighter in shade, so they're also showing signs of decline. So that's just a sense of what's happening there geographically. In terms of the largest, the top 10 largest Jewish populations by borough, this is also interesting, just worth highlighting quickly. These were the top 10 in 2001. Barnet's at the top, followed by Redbridge, Harrow, Camden, Hackney. You can see the league table, if you like, of Jewish populations by borough. This is the league table 10 years later, and this is the league table that was released today. This is how things have changed. And just a few things to kind of point to here. First of all, we've talked a little bit about Redbridge. You can see that it's not just numerical decline that's happened there, but also its positioning in terms of like where it sits in the table. Was the second largest Jewish population by borough in 2001, dropped to 7th and then down to 9th in 2021. Similar story, by the way, in Harrow, from 3rd to 5th to 8th, and numerical decline and positional decline there. The opposite story in Hertsmere, climbing from 6th to 3rd, now the second largest Jewish population by borough, according to these data, certainly. Similar story in Bury, by the way, climbing from 7th to 6th to 4th, Bury in Manchester, also centre of a large Haredi Jewish population. And also worth pointing out Salford, which didn't even appear in the top 10 in 2001 and has climbed from 8th in 2011 to 5th in 2021. Again, important Haredi population in Manchester, very much kind of appearing on the map in a significant way over the course of the last 20 years. In terms of the density of the Jewish population, so this is the proportion of Jews within the whole population of each of these areas. These are the figures for 2001. Barnet was around 15% Jewish, Hertsmere about 11% Jewish, Harrow, Redbridge around the 6% mark. In 2011, this is what the story looks like. And in 2021, this is what the story looks like. Hertsmere actually has overtaken Barnet in terms of density, which is an interesting finding in and of itself. But one of the important things it seems to me just to point out about this is just mentioned Hertsmere, and it's kind of climbed from 11% to 14% to 17%. There's numerical increase, there's also proportional increase, but that's really the exception. If you look at Hackney, for example, the proportion Jewish in that area has remained pretty stable over that period. And similarly, Barnet, even though the population there has grown, proportionally Jews are still around the sort of the 15% mark, and that hasn't really changed very much at all over that period. We don't yet, as I said, have ward level data, but just to show you kind of what's coming and some of the detail that we will get in due course. In 2001, this is ward level now. So this is how many Jews live in really in a neighbourhood level in Hampstead Garden Suburb, Edgware, Golders Green, Hendon, those sorts of areas. Those are the figures for 2001. These are the figures for 2011. As I said, we don't yet have 2021. I hope we would have, but we didn't. That wasn't released today. But all of that information is coming, and of course it'll also come proportionately. And when we look at the proportions at this level, you can see that certainly in 2011. In Kersal, in Salford in Manchester, and it was an area that was 41% Jewish. In Hampstead Garden Suburb, it's almost 40% Jewish. In Golders Green, it's close to 40% Jewish. So at that level, we can see like very significant Jewish population density there. I promised a quick look at Manchester. These are the figures for Manchester. Manchester's divided up into 10 different boroughs. You can see the figures here. If you look across the bottom, the total population, and I've included, by the way, a couple of areas just in South Manchester because they're important parts of the Manchester Jewish community: Cheshire East, Cheshire West, areas like Hale and Altrincham, Bowden. You can see that the number in Manchester has climbed from 22,000 to 25,000 to 29,000, significant increase of the Jewish population there, which is also, I think, an important piece of the story that we are seeing over the first 20 years or so of the 21st century. Let me try and sum up quickly, and then we'll go to some questions. The number released today is incredibly valuable, but I hope, as I've tried to make clear, there's still a huge amount to unpick and there's a huge amount to learn, but we felt it was important just to share our understanding of it as quickly as we possibly could, because we knew there'd be a big conversation within the community about it. As I said, also, this is the first of several data releases about the Jewish population. There's a lot more coming. The next data release, I believe, will be about the age of the Jewish population, which is very, very important in terms of population projections. So that's coming, we believe, in early 2023. So hopefully in a couple of months or so. The geographical data released today highlight what we've talked about in the past about thinning and thickening, that what seems to be happening in the Jewish population is that in certain areas, like in Stamford Hill in London, in parts of Manchester, in parts of Barnet, we're seeing the Jewish populations growing and increasing and becoming more dense. At the same time, we're seeing a thinning out of the Jewish population in many other parts of the country. So Jews are becoming more and more concentrated, whilst at the same time also becoming more and more dispersed. And we're pretty sure, based on what we can see so far from the 2021 census, that story, which was one that we talked about on the basis of the 2011 census data, is continuing to happen. Next thing to say, just as a summary point, the emphasis really in terms of census data should be less on the number that's released today, the 271,000 or so, and more really on the utility of the data, how these data can be used for community planning. That's really where their value lies, and we really hope that JPR will be available as we possibly can be to support community planning and use these census data for that purpose over the coming few years. The next thing to say is that census data are also really critical in terms of the role they play in surveys of the UK Jewish population. In order to assess, when we run surveys of Jewish population, in order to assess how representative that sample is, we rely on census data in order to be able to ascertain what it should look like geographically in terms of the age distribution, in terms of the male-female distribution, etc. When we run surveys, we need census data in order to be able to ensure that they are representative. And it's worth saying just right now that we have a really important survey in the field, the National Jewish Identity Survey, which anybody who self-identifies as Jewish, lives in the UK and is 16 years or older is free and welcome to participate in right now. If you just go to the JPR website, jpr.org.uk, you'll see a banner across the top which you can click on and it will take you directly into that. So if you haven't yet completed that survey, we really encourage you to do so, because that is also an important piece of that will generate some important data for community planning too. Couple of final points. Doing this work is expensive. We've got a really good team of social statisticians and demographers here at JPR. But it does cost a lot of money to do all of the data analysis that we do, not just on census data, but on other data as well. So we are a charity. So if anyone is watching and feels so inclined to make a donation to JPR, you can do that on our website as well. We would really appreciate it. This is an important research program coming up over the next couple of years that needs to be funded. So if you are in a position to make a donation, we would really appreciate that. And lastly, to say there will be that we've released a report with most of what I've said today in it, which is on our website. You can download it for free now if you just go to the JPR website, and within a few minutes, I think, of this event finishing, we'll have a recording of it available also on our website, so you can rewatch it if you are interested in doing so. That's really it for the time being. JPR is really about generating data about the community for the community. I hope I've tried to communicate that message this evening, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my colleague at the JLC, Michelle James, and let's just try and unpick some of what we've seen there.
I mean, there's just a huge amount, John. Thank you so much. It's been really great to hear from you this evening, and I do not underestimate both the speed at which and the volume of data that you and the team have needed to deal with. So thank you for presenting that. I think just to say that at the JLC, we're really an organisation that wants to work strategically, responding to the changing needs and dynamics of the community. And data like this really is vital as we carry out our work. You've talked about how we can use it practically, positively. I think I've started to understand that it's just the introduction of a story that of stability as well as growth in some areas. There's a lot still to find out and unpack, and I'm really looking forward to learning more. We've had a couple of themes of questions coming through, basically, which the first is really about identification and how we might understand the impact of that. For example, there was a campaign to make sure that people really did identify on the survey, on the census when it came around. So kind of what impact might that have had on the increase in numbers that we might have seen? And the balance of that is how might we understand past experiences of identifying as Jewish as a community also affecting it? So there's a little bit about the impact of that. And a second question that we've had come in is about where we have areas of growth. You've talked about the Haredi community, and you have written recently about that as well, and the changing dynamics of our community. So how, with this initial data, can we start to understand, the parts of the growing and shrinking and the demographics of our community? So just in the interest of time, there's two key questions there. One about identification, and another which really is about the changing parts and the demographics of our community as well.
Mm-hmm. So on the first one, look, I mean, fundamentally, there almost certainly are some shifts in how people relate to the question and respond to the question over time. And that factor does need to be accounted for in terms of understanding the pattern of growth that we're seeing. There are a couple of main reasons, I think, why people wouldn't respond to the question. One is that one of the sort of more humorous factors is that the form itself, the paper form, which was used in 2001 and 2011, only had enough space on it for 5 children. So one of the reasons why the Haredim were not enumerated particularly well in 2001, they were enumerated better in 2011, although still by no means perfectly, was that there just wasn't enough space on the form to account for everybody. And whilst you're allowed and you're welcome to ask for a continuation form to ensure that you do account for everybody, that was an issue that came up in 2001. It's been rectified subsequently, and there's been all sorts of efforts made by the Office for National Statistics and indeed the community itself to encourage people to respond to the census question, and that will have had some impact. Nevertheless, fundamentally, the census question and the exercise is basically the same in 2001, 2011, 2021, and when you replicate something, you can be reasonably confident that what you're seeing there is a reasonably accurate picture of reality. There's also a factor around related to anti-Semitism that might play into it. That people may, certainly, I think in 2001 there were some people that were apprehensive about identifying as Jewish on a government form for historical reasons. That's been talked about less in more recent years, but given anxieties about anti-Semitism more recently, perhaps that's a factor as well. And there's also kind of the whole ethnicity issue, and whether people are identifying as ethnically Jewish but not religiously Jewish, and whether that picture is changing in some way.
We've had questions come in about that as well, in terms of where do we sit with that, and should it be an option? Is it helpful, unhelpful?
Right. Well, that's a much bigger conversation that I don't think we have time to delve into today. But in terms of understanding the numbers itself, I think there is a piece of work still to be done around. As I said, there were, I think, 67,000 Jews this time who self-identified as Jewish by ethnicity. We don't yet know how many of them also self-identified as religion. So we don't know how many of them are in the data that we've been looking at this evening and how many of them aren't. In 2001, 2011, the additional people were fairly small couple of thousand in 2001, about 8,000 in 2011. It probably will be higher this time, but we don't yet have that data, that figure at the moment, so we don't know. That's part of the reason why I showed the adjusted figures for non-response, because those, by adjusting in that way, we almost certainly account for a lot of those people who self-identify as Jewish by ethnicity but not by religion. So yeah, I mean, there are caveats around census data and about exactly what we're seeing here. But I think the important thing to bear in mind is that, you know, 90+% of self-identifying Jews are in here, and the point about data utility as opposed to the number, I think, is really important. That, you know, what we have here is an extraordinarily large and detailed data set of the Jewish population, and it's, for me, the census is much more about that than about, you know, is the number, you know, 270,000, 280,000, 300,000, 310,000. That to me is a less important question, really, from a community perspective. And the second question about the Haredi population. Yeah, look, I mean, I think the there are issues with Haredi response to the census, but, you know, what we see time and time again now, or we've seen twice now, is the significant growth in areas like Hackney and Haringey, the Stamford Hill area, also in Bury and Salford in Manchester, and population growth that sounds, based on, you know, what we know about the age profile of that population and what we know about fertility rates and mortality rates and all that sort of thing, we're seeing growth rates in the census that make sense and that chime with other data. There's something odd, as I said, going on in Gateshead that I think we need to understand, but the numbers there are relatively small anyway. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally, one of the things that we know is happening in the Jewish population of this country is that the engine of growth really is in the Haredi population. The non-Haredi population is actually very slowly, gradually declining. But the Haredi population now comprise about 25% of the whole. And as they become a larger and larger part, then that engine of growth will become more potent. And part of the reason why we expected the number to grow from 2011 was because of what's happening in the Haredi community.
So I suppose there's a couple of questions which are asking us, you know, how much can you tell what's going to happen into the future? So how can we use, knowing that we've got now some multiple sets of hopefully useful and reliable data that we can build upon, and just a moment to say that, you know, I appreciate how much this is quite a unique resource in the community across Europe as well, not just in the UK, but how accurate could we be around predicting forward to 2031, for example? And the second question, which I will sneak in, which I know there's been a lot of interest in, which is around schools, because there's obviously been pieces of work, considerable work put into understanding the communal resources that we might need and trying to understand numbers of primary and secondary school children in different places, really thinks about that strategic planning. And then I promise I will hand over in a second.
Yeah. Well, actually, I mean, the two questions are related, and what's the critical data for projections, like what's going to happen in terms of the size of the population over time. The critical data are age data. They haven't yet been released. As I said, we're expecting them in early 2023. And once we have age data alongside geographical data, we begin to be able to kind of make projections of, you know, whether a population is likely to grow or decline over time. The geographical data, I think, point to trends, but it's when we get the age data that we're able to look at that in much more detail. So in terms of thinking about schools, that's really what we're waiting for. There's a certain amount of work that can be done using 2011 census data, because anyone who was born pre-2011 is in that data set. The particular challenge around schools is with primary schools, because pretty well all the children now in primary schools weren't born in 2011. In fact, all of them. I think none of them were born when the 2011 census took place. So we're sort of waiting for those data from this census in order to be able to understand that younger age band and exactly what's happened with them. in order to be able to make projections of particularly primary school children. So yeah, the age data are really, really critical. But there's a lot more in there, as I said. You know, there's data on health, there's data on employment, there's data on education, there's data on wealth that also kind of feed into thinking about community planning in a whole variety of different ways.
Before I pass over to Debbie Fox, the Vice Chair of the JLC, just a thank you from us for the continued work of your team. And I'm really excited to be able to unpack a little bit more and use this really in our strategic work at the JLC. So thank you so much, John. Really appreciate it.
Thank you too, and thank you for co-sponsoring the event. Really, really appreciate it. And the report, indeed, which is also co-sponsored by the JLC.
Thank you. I'm delighted to hand over to Debbie Fox, who's the Vice Chair of the JLC, just to have some closing words. Thanks so much, Debbie.
Thank you, Michelle. And it is down to me to close what has been a really important last hour, hazarding a guess that actually most of us could continue to listen to you as ever, John. So first of all, enormous thanks to you, John, and to your JPR team, not just for what we've heard tonight, but of course for your preparedness and being ready to receive this data and working so hard in these last 8 hours to turn it around and to present so remarkably. As you've emphasised, this is of course the first of several releases, and I think you can hear and see from the questions that we wait with eager anticipation to the next release and to hearing from you. I'd also like to thank you, Stephen, as Chair of JPR, for recognising the close working relationship that we have at the JLC with JPR. The JLC holds data-driven decision-making really as a core value, and the relationship that the JLC has with JPR really adds enormous value to how we can continue to deliver services to our members and to the wider community. I would also like to thank Shock 8 Audio for all your tech support and for hosting this evening. And last but not least, to the JLC team for working in the background on the work that we have heard tonight, and for your continued commitment to work in this area, supporting long-term strategic planning. Michelle, thank you very much indeed. And ahead of the rest of this evening, thank you all for joining, and look forward to seeing you for the next release.